Good evening, everyone who's joined us tonight. My name is Brandon Holmes, co-director at the Urban Justice Center's Freedom Agenda. Tonight, we are excited for you to join this conversation as we talk about the role that anyone who seeks to hold office anywhere across New York City is accountable to the types of change and transformation that we need long-term to end mass incarceration, fully invest in communities, and transform the way we seek justice or rehabilitation in our communities. Today, New York City has 14 jails with approximately 17,500 beds. In October 2019, after years of organizing by people who have been directly harmed by Rikers Island, the City Council passed a plan to replace 3 current borough facilities and construct 1 additional, in order to close all existing jails in New York City and establish a much smaller system of 4 facilities with capacity to detain no more than 3,300 individuals, while improving conditions of confinement for anyone still detained. In November 2020, the city map was changed to prohibit incarceration on Rikers Island after the date August 31st, 2027. Along with this plan in 2019, the city also committed to a set of community investment demands that responded to some of our demands developed with over 80 service providers and community organizations across the 5 boroughs. But this only represents just the beginning of what the city needs to do to reinvest in communities harmed by decades of mass criminalization, hyper-militaristic policing, and mass incarceration. A set of bills also passed along with the plan in 2019 that set new minimum standards for detention facilities, new reporting requirements for law enforcement agencies, and established a commission on community reinvestment that will be made up of primarily people who have been formerly incarcerated and directly impacted by incarceration. This is a plan that survivors of mass incarceration and survivors of Rikers Island shaped from the beginning. First, by demanding that Mayor de Blasio take swift action to close Rikers when he was still set on renovating it. When the first announcement of the borough jails was made in February 2018, formerly incarcerated leaders engaged in a scenario mapping guided by their experiences on Rikers Island and in other jails and prisons across the state. By their commitment to getting as many people free as possible, as fast as possible, by their concerns about the conditions of confinement for anyone who remains incarcerated, and by their vision for a city and a world that invests in community-based resources, not law enforcement, to create safety and stability in our neighborhoods. And by an analysis of the power we've built and the work still ahead of us. Those conversations led them to advocate for a plan that would reduce incarceration much further than the city had planned, commit to more fully transforming the way any and all detention facilities are operated, and ensure deep investment in our communities. We're excited for some of those leaders to speak to you tonight on this evening's panel. And I want to introduce your moderator for this evening, Yolanda Johnson-Peterkin.
Thank you so much, Brandon. We are so excited about this evening. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get right down to hearing our information. So glad that you were able to join us. We know that we'll be doing quite some movement on the agenda tonight. Yes. With that, we have a very special lineup for you this evening. We have Kandra, who is the Vice President of Policy and Strategy with Exodus Transitional Community. I'm sure you're familiar with it. She is a preventive reentry and advocacy, organization. She oversees Exodus policy and advocacy efforts, including supporting the closure of Rikers Island and the transformation of our justice system. Moreover, she is the person who is raising the funds for Exodus, and she has done a fabulous job, including writing governmental foundation grants and proposals and meeting with potential donors. She has recently earned her master's degree in public policy and administration, and she is definitely fire, and you will hear from her. But guess what? Sitting with her will be none other than our own Johnny Perez. Drawing from the wisdom of 13 years of direct involvement with criminal justice system, Johnny Perez worked as the director of the U.S. Prisons Program for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. You can find him anywhere, and sometimes you can find that cell somewhere he's showing you that you do not want to be inside having any type of torture while you're incarcerated. Yes, Mr. Perez coordinates the NRCAT existing campaign efforts to end torture of solitary confinement, adding a value and strategic insight to building the capacity of faith leaders and directed impacted communities. To engage the public education and legislative advocacy across the United States. That's right, traveling. That's my brother. Sharon Harrigan-White, okay, come on, is the executive director. We cannot forget the Women's Community Justice Association, a gender-specific trauma-informed advocacy agency for justice that uplifts and amplifies the voices of what? Women, yes. She also serves as an advisory member in Survivors Justice Project, a co-lead in Bedford Hills Project, a strategic consultant to the Women in Justice Project. And she doesn't have here, she's also a teacher, a professor, that's right. And she also is a sister as well. But don't forget, we have somebody bringing it up the rear. That is Mr. Darren Mack. He is the co-director of the Freedom Agenda. And thank you to the Freedom Agenda for having us have this gathering this evening for informational purposes and to learn, isn't that right? A member-led project dedicated to organizing people and community impacted by incarceration. They're going to achieve decarceration and system transformation. So not just building it back like it was, we're going to do it all different this time. Yes, Darren served approximately 20 years straight throughout New York State prison system, including 19 months on Rikers Island when the population was over 20,000. So you're going to hear from the experts tonight. But we also like to thank the Humanities Action Lab at Rutgers University for co-hosting this event. They are the core partners in the Rikers Public Memory Project, a community effort to document and address the legacy and harms that Rikers Island has done. We are excited to host the conversation and grateful to everyone who has made time to join us. Elected officials, we know that you're going to commit yourselves to getting educated on these issues this evening. And further, if you need to, because I'm going to give you everybody's contact, yes, by people most impacted by the issue. It should be a common sense opportunity, but it isn't always. So the focus of our panel tonight will be here. You'll be hearing from people who have experienced incarceration in the New York City jail system. We'll address some questions from our participants after the overview of the panelists, but we also want you to put those questions in the chat box as we go along, so we may be able to answer them throughout the evening. For people listening, you can send your questions at any time, and we'll address them we'll address as many as we can in the Q&A. So let's get started. We continue to hear Rikers Island referred to as a prison or jail. Sharon, could you start us off by walking us through what Rikers is and the problem with it?
Well, thank you so much, Yolanda, and I'm very honored and happy to be a part of this special panel, especially with my colleagues who are just awesome in their unique ways. So, Rikers Island, the basics of Rikers Island. It is a complex made up of 10 jails. 6 of them are active, 4 of them are vacant, with over 14,700 jail beds that has been used to incarcerate people since the 1930s. Before that, Rikers Island was owned for over 200 years by the Riker family, and the most notorious of the member was Richard Riker. And although his position overseeing the city's criminal courts, he used his power to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Right. So he led a group of officials that conspired to sell free Black men. I'm going to say that again. Sell free Black men accused of being fugitive slaves to the South without due process. So they came to be known as the Kidnapping Club. So the use of Rikers Island to incarcerate primarily Black people who have mostly yet to not have a trial, to yet have a trial. I mean, it continues. This, slavery, okay, continues. And so the entire 400 plus acre land is controlled by the Department of Corrections, DOC, and at one time detained over 20,000 people, as it was said. Almost all of the approximately 4,600 people currently held in custody of DOC is held on Rikers Island, and approximately 94% of the people held there are awaiting trial or parole hearing. 87% of the people held there are Black or Latinx, right? So the problem with Rikers simply is Rikers, right? One, isolation. Rikers Island is not accessible, and it's only accessible by one long bridge, right? And one city bus line. So there's one way in, one way out. This isolation has many different impacts. Public defenders, lawyers, social workers, family members, people are just really find it very difficult to get to their clients, to their loved ones. It's an all-day process just for a few hours. The other part is it's a toxic land. Come on, folks. Rikers Island started out as 87 acres when it was first designated to New York as a primary jail. They used landfill, yes, and what is that? It's garbage, right? To build out the rest and prison labor from Blackwell's Island in order to get it done. So the decomposing landfill, of course, emits toxic methane gas that threatens the health of all of the people who are held there, including those who work there. What is the other part? The conditions of the building. Many of the jails on Rikers Island are very old, they're decrepit, they are in poor conditions, right? Many of the buildings are on decomposing landfill, and it shifts, it causes cracks in the walls and the ceiling. The housing unit lacks air conditioning and adequate electrical wiring. And there is a big problem with rodents and insects that are running around, faulty plumbing, and including, right, not excluding discolored water and broken toilets, right? The capacity at Rikers Island, as long as Rikers Island exists, right? New York City will have over 400 acres of land devoted to incarceration, right? And the ability to build more jails or expand capacity there with little public approval required, right? So New York City never needed and does not now need an entire island with almost 15,000 jail beds to lock up New Yorkers. Lastly, I just want to put out there the culture of violence that is on Rikers Island. And the language of Rikers is violence. And in 2014, federal prosecutors sued the city of New York over what the Justice Department investigation called the pervasive and deep-seated culture of violence. So violence and abuse pervade most jails and prisons, but the particular isolation of Rikers Island has enabled a culture of impunity to take hold, and the isolation of the jails have thwarted oversight efforts. The rates of sexual violence on Rikers Island are almost higher than the national average, particularly for women, right, who are subjected to rates of sexual violence nearly 3 times higher than the national average. And that's what I have for you folks.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was very informative. Some of those things I hadn't heard about Rikers Island. So if you want to get that information, we will make sure that you get a copy of what Sharon just explained to us about the decrepitcy of Rikers Island. Yes, thank you again, Sharon. Now, Darren, there are 4 jails in New York City, and some of them are not on Rikers. Could you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, sure. So let's begin with the Queen's House of Detention in Kew Gardens, and next to the courts which was built in 1961. So the structure still exists. However, that facility has been closed since 2002. Why? Primarily because that Queen facility does not meet the state minimum standards. Then we could go to Brooklyn House, built in 1957, much older than the Queen's House, and therefore did not meet the state minimum standards, but was grandfathered in until it closed in 2003. Then everyone from Brooklyn, went straight to what I call the Abu Ghraib of New York City, also commonly known as Rikers Island. But after the renovation, Brooklyn House reopened in 2012. I myself spent some time there. I know I experienced it. However, I recall just last summer during the heat wave, responding to the complaints and pleas of incarcerated people in Brooklyn House. I protested in front of Brooklyn House with the Jails Action Coalition, which is a coalition dedicated to defending the human rights and safety of people detained in city jails. That action drew enough attention for the Board of Correction and elected officials to make a surprise visit inside the facility, and instantly, immediately they understood that conditions matter. So I don't have to imagine, what it is like to be there because I was detained there. And Brooklyn House closed actually this year. Then there's the Manhattan Detention Complex, also known as the Tombs. And I find it odd that it's called the Tombs, and there's a reason for that. But there are living human beings detained there. MDC, or also known as the Tombs, lacks the adequate programming space, visiting space, and the list goes on. When I think of MDC, I think about the rebellion that occurred there a year before the Attica Uprising, which the historian Orisami Burton, who brilliantly wrote about the Tombs Uprising in a piece called Organized Disorder, I believe the title was. And then finally, there's the Vernon C. Bain facility, also known as the Boat. The Boat, it is a jail ship, and it's anchored adjacent to the Bronx. And I recall one of my colleagues, Marvin Mayfield, he's a directly impacted leader who was detained on a boat, and he described it as a modern day slave ship owned by the city of New York. So those are basically, my experiences and what other directly impacted experiences, with these current city jails that exist today.
Thank you so much, Darren. And I hope that everyone is paying attention to our chat, because we're putting in information where you can just go to and find out about everything that Darren just talked about. But Kandra is going to tell us about the current city's plan to be able to demolish, get rid of, close Rikers Island, rebuild it. Enough is enough. 2027 is too long, but enough is enough, right? We're getting ready to get rid of it. But Kandra, people are asking, and they want to know, what will ensure that if we renovate facilities, that they're better than the old one?
Absolutely, and thank you all for joining us tonight for this. And I think if we just take a moment and think right now during this pandemic, right, during COVID, even at the height when we were able to decarcerate the number of people on Rikers Island to 3,800, there was still 3,800 people that were detained on Rikers, and not just Rikers, but in the city jails, right? The 14 city jails. There was still 3,800 people that were detained. And I think that really just goes to show that even during a pandemic, if we really want to reach abolition, which means that prosecutors are never going to bring any detention eligible charges to a judge, and that a judge will never order a remand, we have to, really transform all of our systems in order to actually reach that day. That while we still have judges that are going to order remand, and while there are going to be prosecutors that are going to bring detention eligible charges to a judge, that conditions that the people are detained in matter, and that we can transform our systems to address the root causes of incarceration. We can organize to make sure the current conditions in city jails do not transfer over to the new borough-based facilities. And we can collectively work to transform the design, the culture, and the programming of the facilities in a way that reduces the harm of incarceration and the likelihood of people cycling back into jail. And those are our strategies that we can use to actually reach abolition. In fact, there's several other countries and several other states, some states that are not to be known as progressive as New York City and New York State, and do not have as many resources as what we have out here, that have already begun to work on this effort. And New York City actually as a whole has already experienced a trip to Europe where they were able to really look at correctional facility settings out there and see how they were able to transform their systems. It was just back in the 90s where their systems were very similar to ours. There was extremely high rates of violence. Recidivism rates were nearly 70%. Suicide rates were extremely high among correctional officers. And as countries, they decided that they were going to transform these systems. And there's blueprints that we could use, and states are already using some of those blueprints. So New York City is already a little bit behind on what we could really do. So in September of 2019, like I said, there were several of us, including members of the Department of Correction, members of the mayor's office, activists such as myself who are formerly incarcerated, designers, and members of the Lippman Commission who actually got to go on this tour. And while we all agree incarceration should be a last resort and investments in communities most impacted by incarceration must be made, and we also, I'm hoping there's a lot of district attorneys and elected officials that are on today really listening to this while we're working to garner more investments and alternatives and preventative measures. We really have to also focus on the conditions of what these new facilities are going to look like. And again, the reduction from that 17,500 number down to the 3,300 number that we're really aiming for. And some of the principles that we can really bring back, if you think of culture as a bucket, right? So, the Nunez report has been out several times, right? Violence and at the hands of correctional staff is not hidden. I mean, we know this for facts for decades. And with the most recent Nunez report that just came out, it's at an all-time high with a staff to detained person ratio of 2 to 1. So as we're continuing to decarcerate and there's less people who are detained on the island, The number of correctional staff is not decreasing, but the number of violence incidents are increasing. And so the first thing that we could really do is replace the Department of Corrections with an agency that can respond to the needs and not cause more harm. So really thinking through what kind of city agency could we work with that could actually get this done, because we're not moving forward. We're not able to move forward and get anything done with the Department of Corrections. Again, job descriptions, job announcements, humanizing language, all of those things and how we view what we want out of the staff is going to be really important. If you look at the current job descriptions and job announcements of the Department of Corrections, everything is around safety of the staff, safety of the facility, like as the Department of Corrections as a whole. It's not about the people that they're actually serving, right? So if we were to reallocate those job descriptions, really redesign them and think through our hiring process and our training process and all of those different processes, we could actually create more of a culture that we're looking for. So in Europe, for example, they do 2 years of training. You have to take an ethics exam. You have to go through social work school. A lot of their correctional staff there are former clergy or former social workers. So it's really around the hiring process and ensuring that you're not hiring someone who is going to abuse their power, right? Abuse their discretion. And then we can also do several other things, such as like the import model, which is really using the community in a new way and incorporating more of the community aspects into the borough-based facilities. For example, the library system that's going to be in the borough-based facilities, they could be overseen by the public library system out here. The Department of Education should be overseeing the schooling that's inside. It's still being oversaw by DOC right now. And that's part of the powers. Part of the problem is there's no relinquishment of power. We need to collectively come together and have all of our systems work so that, everyone is looking out for the people who are incarcerated first. That's the #1 goal. When we think around the design, the space for programming is super important. The reason that we need the borough-based facilities to be larger for a smaller amount of people is because we want to double the size of the current space for folks. Right now, people are on top of each other in there. There is no room for therapy. There is not a lot of space for programming. There is no workshops, right? Training workshops where you can actually learn hard skills trainings. So we really want to increase that space. We also want to allow for like private rooms with keys where you have agency, right? Where you have autonomy, where you don't lose everything about you. I remember being on Rikers, spending those 4 months there, and you have no agency at all, right? You forget even who you are. You can't have pictures of your family on the wall, or you get a ticket and you go to solitary confinement, right? So you're not even allowed to have that. Lighting, windows, all of those things really matter when you're inside. And take it from someone who's sat inside cells, right? There's a better way that we could empower folks to actually, address those root causes of why they became incarcerated in the first place. And then the last thing is really around programming. And as I kind of hit on it before, our current system is designed where folks do not get any kind of trades or skills, right? Nothing is translated to the outside world. I remember working inside, and then when trying to come home and get a job in that field, they all laughed at me because it was not translating to the outside world. So really thinking through, what are the programming we need? What are some hard skills trainings that we can provide folks with that'll actually get them careers as opposed to minimum wage employment opportunities when they come home, right? Getting them into career fields. And again, also, helping people understand and overcome trauma, empowering folks to move forward, connections to housing. If we don't have housing in this city, folks are going to be released and they're going to end up going back into the system. And these are things that we can work on right now, moving from re-entry to one day being no entry, right? So collectively, we can hold the city accountable to make real change. All of us organizations have been working together for decades on this. There's over 100 orgs and thousands of directly impacted people working across the city right now. And we welcome the partnership of candidates or future elected officials looking to improve the existing plan to close Rikers, but the only clear result of stopping or stalling it would be a continuation of old structures and systems of punishment and brutality on Rikers, in the existing borough jails, and at the hands of the Department of Corrections. And that's not something we're going to stand up for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kandra. We appreciate that thorough look at what is currently happening and what those particular facilities are doing now and what we need to do in the future. But some of us are thinking, that's going to come at quite a cost. Johnny, can you explain to us why the cost is worthwhile and how we should think about this cost in light of other important budget needs and priorities like housing, which she mentioned, and education, and etc. So explain why that might be important.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Yolanda. Thank you for all the panelists that came before me. Y'all all covered really strong and important points. Thank you for everyone that's here. I see it's about 93 people on the call, and here it is on a Tuesday now. So obviously, folks are this is important. Yolanda, directly, to answer the question about costs, let me set my thing up here. To answer the question about costs, really is centered and rooted in a deeper conversation of not only looking at the criminal justice landscape across New York City after we close Rikers, but also in the conditions of confinement of existing and proposed borough jails. So on one hand, we have to ask this question: as we close Rikers Island, right, are we going to still incarcerate folks in New York City the day after we close it? And if that answer is yes, then we must look at the conditions of confinement in New York City after Rikers Island closes. And we can do that with the acknowledgement that we should use confinement as limited as possible and always as a measure of last resort. Like, I can tell you from direct experience of living and existing and trying to survive in both Rikers Island, but also in existing borough-based facilities, I cannot stress enough the direct connection between the conditions of confinement and a person's success long after incarceration and during incarceration and or detainment. And in fact, we shouldn't aim for conditions, in fact, we should not aim for any of the conditions for any existing facilities to be cheap, because in and of itself, that endangers the safety of both incarcerated people and the folks who are there, and the folks who also work there, including staff, including medical staff, correctional staff. So what on the surface seems to be a very hefty or a significant expense, right? We have to understand that one is a one-time expense and only represents 8% of the New York City's 10-year, $116.9 billion capital plan. And I'll repeat that again, since folks like hard numbers. Again, it only represents 8% of the New York City's 10-year, $116.9 billion capital plan. So here's some more hard numbers, right? Especially as we usher in what I like to think is a new era of progressive thinkers and leaders in New York City and beyond, right? I'll also add that this means making significant investments, in the community, like some of the past panelists already said, in doing away with the harm that is inflicted on our communities by law enforcement. So here it is, even after budget cuts that affected all city agencies, though not evenly, right? In the fiscal year of 2021, the NYPD still retains $5.2 billion annual expense budget, and the Department of Corrections, right? Their annual budget is $1.2 billion. So with that, I ask the question, do police officers make us safer? Does incarceration prevent crime and make us feel safer? Right? There's voluminous data that suggests that the answer is no, and that's beyond my short time on this panel. Right? So we can reallocate resources away from punishment and harm, right, and directly into our communities, the preservation of our families, our health, our future, right? And we can also think about not only about these upfront costs, right, reallocating funds away from different departments that are causing harm, right, but also we can think about it in terms of saving both hard costs and more importantly for me, and I like to even say for other folks on the call, the moral costs and the ripple effects of what it means to when we fail our incarcerated neighbors. And I use that term very intentionally because these are folks who are part of our community who have decided to balance them and separate them, and then we expect them to assimilate themselves back into society seamlessly as if nothing happened. I'll mention that the Lemon Commission has estimated that shifting to a smaller borough-based jail system, with renovated facilities, will save roughly $540 million a year, right? Where folks will be closer to their family, reentry services, course, and access to all the meaningful mental health services, right? Which brings me to my last point. When we look at who's there, the questions and the answer becomes that much clearer. So here it is. We have a place where we live in a city where 40% of the people who are being held inside of a jail cell are living with mental health concerns. So the question is, why are they there, right? For the folks running for DA's office, right? And then then the other question is, right now what do we do and how do we respond, right? Because we're in the middle of the movie. So right now, as it stands, people with mental health concerns are routinely placed in, actually maybe a lot because of COVID and other areas, but solitary confinement still exists in the city where people are being placed there. And that, again, looking at the conditions of confinement and the connection, when we harm people inside, it hurts them outside. And if you think that what happens in jail, you know, stays in there, that's not true. So the New York City Jails Action Coalition and the whole solitary campaign actually presented 5 steps to ending solitary confinement, you know, across New York City. And there's a blueprint, and they created this blueprint that have already been shared with the mayor's office. And we completely denounce the working group as a stall tactic when we already laid out the blueprint, right? I also talk about the connections between the city and state. And I'll say that, you know, a lot of times what happens in a city does impact what happens elsewhere. So staying on the riff of solitary confinement, right? Very recently, the Partnership for Public Good released a report that said that passing the whole Solitary Confinement Act would actually save the state $132 million a year. And those are hard numbers, but I wanna really emphasize before I let you all go and go into my time, right? That the true cost here, right, is not in dollars, because behind every dollar there's a person, but also the communities, but also the cost of what it means when you release somebody into society without the proper mental health services. When you release somebody into society who has been traumatized and harmed while they're incarcerated, because right now, 2 people get into a fight, they're both going to solitary confinement. We know that they both go back into the same communities, and then we call police to respond to it. So we really have to understand the root cause and exact nature of a lot of the problems that we're now throwing law enforcement behind, and we're now throwing all of these devices that are only perpetuating the same harm. And then the last thing I'll say, super off script here for folks who are running office, you know, we belong to these communities, and you have to make a decision whether you're going to represent us or not. And for those who are making a conscious decision to not represent the communities, then you should expect us to hold you accountable, because it is bigger than any one advocate, and it is bigger than any chair, whether it's across the board, regardless of what office you're running for. So again, my name is Johnny Perez, Director of U.S. Prison Programs at the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, and I'm a native of New York, live in the Bronx, and thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you so much, Johnny. So you guys are getting a lot of information. You are connected to 4 gurus of information, and they have been working really hard on all of the different issues that have been pointed out here this evening. So you've heard from them, but we're going to go back a bit. Thank you, Johnny, so much. You can hear the passion in all of their voices, and they have been doing this quite some time. So all of us have a certain lane to play. And so if I need some information about what is happening on Rikers, I'm going to call Kandra. If I want to talk about women, I'm going to call Sharon. I need to talk about what is happening with solitary confinement. Guess what? I'm calling Johnny. But we have Darren as well. And Darren is very well rounded on the freedom agenda. And Darren, talk a little bit about the campaign to close Rikers Island and its core decarceration campaign. Last year, advocates secured a commitment from the city to reduce New York City jails population to less than 3,300, the lowest level, hold on, in 100 years. And so it was advocates, it was parents, it was teachers, it was everybody talking about close Rikers, right? And so can you walk us through how New York City can meet the goal of decarceration even further?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a big question, a loaded question. So I guess I could start off by saying that, you know, the historian Heather N. Thompson, she wrote the book called Blood in the Water. She described the carceral system as an octopus with many tentacles. You know, cops is a tentacle, jails is a tentacle, parole and probation officers is a tentacle. DAs are tentacles of the carceral system. So therefore, it's going to take a multiple-pronged, broad-based collaborative approach to shrink the system from over 17,000 beds down to 3,300, from 14 jails across the city down to 4, and continue to incarcerate further. So we can close Rikers and the boat. And address conditions of confinement and address the conditions of communities impacted by mass criminalization and systemic racism. It's not either or, as my colleagues laid out. It's both and. And we're not going to meet our target if we just focusing on releasing people who with petty offenses, low-level, non-violent charges, because over 70% of the people currently incarcerated in the city jails are facing charges legally defined as violent. As we all know, even when no one is harmed, like stealing a book bag is defined as violent. So one of the things that this administration, before it leaves office, the end of next year, they can do is to divest from district attorneys' offices and the DOC, as well as the other carceral tentacles, and make further investments in service-based alternatives to detention programs, like those that have helped, to reduce the number of women, incarcerated pre-trial, regardless of the charges they face. And I have to say it, like this term progressive prosecutor is an oxymoron to me. Prosecutors, they could commit to never seeking bail or remand. Although like judges are still like remand or set bail on people, but prosecutors could commit to that. And, prosecutors could go even further by saying, I'm not going to charge anyone with a detention eligible offense. They could do that. My shirt says, I don't know if folks can see it, but it says transcend the punishment paradigm. So, if you say you're a progressive prosecutor, then make a commitment to do that. Then we could focus our energy, these advocates and organizers and activists could focus our energies elsewhere, like the judges. And then there's so many things to enumerate, like the Less is More New York Act, which is active legislation right now, could be passed and end the incarceration of people for technical parole violations, like missing a curfew, changing your address and not informing the PO, or smoking marijuana, missing a parole appointment. This could impact, across New York State, but it'll also have an impact on people currently incarcerated in a city jail. And the mayor and the city council, could end city year sentences. There's a program called the 6A Early Release Program, I believe is the name. It's been proven to be a successful program, and they could be utilizing it even more. End city year sentences. That could be done this current administration. And there's more, but I'll end with, more importantly, probably the most important thing, for especially me, because I come from what I call a crisis community. Those 7 communities that incarcerated people, found that over 70% of New York State prison population come from, Harlem, Bronzeville, East New York, Bed-Stuy, So I think what's important is that investing these resources, divesting from the carceral system and investing resources into our communities to meet housing needs, to meet people mental health needs, and fund credible messages, cure violence programs, and other non-carceral programs and those services to scale. And that's what, and those are just some of the things, that I can mention off the top of the head, but there's much more. There's much more to tackle these tentacles of the carceral system.
Thank you so much, Darren. We appreciate that. And please don't shout out East New York or Brownsville again, you know what I mean? Because we coming up, just so you know. So thank you so much. We know that closing the jails on Rikers is important to reducing the capacity of incarcerated people in New York City, and for recognizing the human rights of incarcerated people. But it also creates an opportunity to use the island for other purposes. Kandra, can you talk to us about what could or should happen with the island once the jail is closed?
Absolutely. And this is something that we've been working on since 2018, and even before, really, right? When we were all thinking around closing Rikers, we absolutely wanted to make sure that the people who have been most directly harmed by Rikers have the most important say in kind of what happens afterwards. So back in 2018, advocates convened a Build Community series of workshops, one specifically focused on environmental justice, 8 neighborhood assemblies. Hundreds of directly and indirectly impacted people participated. And with that information, we met with the council member Costanides, and I know I'm probably chopping up his last name, I always do, to discuss the idea of using the island for renewable energy sources. So as the community most harmed by Rikers' legacy, we wanted to ensure that the future use of the island meets the greatest impact for the communities most harmed, right? And in order to do that, let me give you a little bit of background, right? Environmental justice and social justice are extremely interconnected. Low-income neighborhoods and communities of color are often home to so-called peaker plants, which only activate whenever the city's energy demands increase, right? It's basically like a power plant. Correlation has been found between these peaker plants that emit toxins and respiratory illness. Neighborhoods were denied a voice in the early 2000s when the power companies built these peaker plants on the promise that turbines would only operate for 3 years, yet they have been in operation for over 18 years, and they only continue to operate whenever more affluent communities need more power. 10 of the 11 plants are located in what the State Department of Environmental Conservation has branded environmental justice neighborhoods. So these are the neighborhoods that have been most impacted by environmental injustice. So in partnership with Councilmember Costanides' office, CUNY Law School Center for Urban Environmental Reform conducted a study, and they said that using just 100 acres of Rikers Island for solar energy generation and storage could justify closing all 11 of those peaker plants. We could also divert wastewater from the South Bronx and Northern Queens to a state-of-the-art treatment facility on the island that would allow 80-year-old ones to close, thus freeing up hundreds of city-owned acres for public use. So what we can do is then invest in the preventative resources in those communities that have been most harmed and use all that land that's going to be, through closing the peaker plants, as well as through, doing the wastewater treatment plant and really diverting all of it to that specific plant on the island. We could build housing, we could build youth centers, we could build training programs, we could provide, build mental health treatment centers. It's public use, and this would be an opportunity for those communities to really come and say exactly what they need in those areas. Is it youth centers? I know youth centers are something that almost every community needs, right? And so with this, in June of 2019, the Renewable Rikers Act was introduced to the City Council, and it was introduced by Councilmember Costanides, and Helen Rosenthal also is one of the co-sponsors on it. And the 3 bills which are, on the floor right now, which City Council could pass right now, are Intro 1591, which would require New York City to assess whether a new wastewater treatment facility can be constructed on the island, as well as determine how many gallons of wastewater from surrounding areas could be diverted to there. And that's important because that'll allow us to figure out how much land we're going to have available in those neighborhoods that have been most directly impacted. Intro 1592, which we think is one of the most important intros, it transfers the jurisdiction of Rikers Island from the Department of Corrections to the Department of Environmental Protection for infrastructure such as renewable energy. So as soon as 2027 closes, which we're all still trying to push that date up, we all want a 2024 date or even sooner, we would be able to transfer that land over. And that would really implement that it's one more layer that's added on as protection that Rikers Island would never be able to house jails again, right? In fact, DOC would not have any rights to that land if we could pass Intro 1592. And the last intro is 1593, which requires New York City to determine the feasibility of the renewable energy sources that can be generated on there, as well as the large scale batteries to store power. So as we know, there's been some talk around why couldn't housing work, right, on Rikers, or why couldn't expanding the airport work? And, we really want to continue to center this conversation around, Rikers Island is environmentally toxic. For more than 80 years, people that the city has not wanted have been sent there, right? They've sent folks for mental health, poverty, substance use, all the root causes of incarceration. And it's been a human rights disaster for 80 years. People do not belong there. And again, with closing those peaker plants, we could build the same amount of housing in the neighborhoods that need it most than what we, or even more, is my guess, housing, than what we would have been able to build on Rikers anyway. So you're really getting a 2-for-1. This is the smartest, most impactful decision for the city to make around creating a renewable energy source. And again, with expanding the airport, there's no clear benefits to impacted communities, no citywide benefit toward meeting our climate justice goals. It's a very far-fetched idea that is not really going to hold any weight moving forward. So, you know, Renewable Rikers, again, we've created a coalition. There's several council members who have signed on to the bills. The directly impacted community at large, with over 100 orgs and several, you know, individual members and environmental justice agencies are all really throwing all of their support behind this. So again, it's been years in the making, and it's something that we could do right now, and future administrations can, you know, continue to see this project through. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for that, Kandra. And we want to go on to the questions that we have in our Q&A. Thank you so much for posting your questions. What happened to my questions? All righty then. Love to hear more about the plans to shrink and eliminate DOC. Darren, could you take that for us?
Yeah, I saw that question. I heard that question. I saw that question before in another a panel that I was on. So last year, like directly impacted people submitted like an open letter to correctional officers, right? And it was basically a plan regarding a just transition. You know, COs, I'm trying to stop saying correctional officers, COs, because it's like a lot of them is corrupt oppressors. So I'm gonna say COs. COs is a city job, you know, and there are a lot of city jobs, you know, in our city that not filled, you know, that's non-carceral jobs, you know, jobs that is not wrapped around punishment in this carceral system. So, you know, transitioning from one city job, which is, you know, part of the carceral system, to another city job that, you know, that could contribute to like the healing of communities. You know, there's like so many other jobs. You know, we need to do an analysis and see what jobs are not filled, you know, in our city, you know, that city jobs that we could actually fill, that we could actually train people who are COs and train them into these positions to reduce, you know, the population of, you know, COs that we have currently right now. Because currently we have, for every person incarcerated, there's 2 correctional officers in the system, you know? So that's just one way, a just transition. And the other thing that I'm also thinking about is that, you know, divesting from DOC, as we divest from the DOC and invest in other entities, you know, like social service programs, you know, different community like programs to curb violence or conflict, you know, that creates jobs. You know, that creates jobs in spaces in a field that we need to actually bring up the scale. You know, COVID-19 exposed a lot of things about our current system, you know, like as far as the healthcare system. We need to be doing investments in that, and we need to be creating city jobs in that field as well. So those are like two things: the just transition into city jobs and investing in those institutions like schools, like healthcare, and creating jobs in those spaces in order to deal with that issue to shrink the system.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Darren. I don't know why I keep having, this is wonderful. Wonderful. So do you have any ideas or for how to negotiate accountability and oversight to the Correctional Officers Benevolent Association collective bargain agreements? We're going to let Brandon take that one. Brandon?
Right, thank you, Yolanda. But yeah, others, please feel free to jump in here too. I see that question came from Jeffrey. I do want to be clear that the position of Freedom Agenda, and this is not the position of all the organizations on this call, but folks can chime in, is that we want to dissolve the current DOC, that we don't see, with an agency that, as Kandra had mentioned before, has been sued and has had a federal monitor from the Obama administration monitoring them and reporting that each year the rates and incidents of violence have increased while the population has gone down and staffing and budgeting at the agency has remained the same. We just don't see that there's any space for that negotiation or compromise in preserving any part of the legacy or culture that they've created in New York City jails. But one thing that we do acknowledge that Darren had mentioned before is that this is a city job, right? That the same thing we saw this past year where the defense of city council's failure to take $1 billion from NYPD was that the people who would be disproportionately impacted by those cuts would be women of color, officers of color who worked in schools. That was the defense, right? We recognize that the predominantly people who are corrections officers come from the same communities that are over-policed, over-incarcerated, over-represented in our jail system. And that these are jobs that people take as an opportunity to break into the middle class in our communities, right? An opportunity to get a city job with a pension, right? And benefits and all of that. So we want to identify areas that we can fight for a just transition, recognizing that in our future in New York City, there will be no place for these punitive law enforcement roles in the agencies that have led these roles. But how do we create a just transition, as Darren had kind of alluded to, that starts to fully invest in treatment and healthcare roles and other roles for public safety and public health and education and youth employment services like mental health, first responders? How do we invest in all of this infrastructure and create a new sector of New York City public jobs, of government jobs, that is not solely built on a legacy of oppression and violence? So we're not really in a position to say that we are interested, or we're not interested, that Freedom Agenda of negotiating accountability and oversight with the Corrections Officers Union, who is currently suing to keep empty jails open and operational to preserve jobs. We're not in a position to negotiate with them, and we'd rather start talking to them about how they can imagine a future where they are not working in punitive roles for this on behalf of the city of New York.
Thank you so much for that, Brandon. And just so individuals know, there are facilities that are across the United States that are actually doing it just a teeny tiny bit better. If you go to Maine and you go to the women's facility, it smells like baked bread, and the women who are inside are the ones that will walk you through the facility. They also have an opportunity to pick their own substance and or abuse programming so that it fits with their journey back into the community. They don't have a lot of women, but they're certainly making sure that they definitely have a high success rate. And I think that Kandra did mention that if we start to look at other designs, maybe we can come up with something that is not as punitive as Brandon has said. So equipped and trained and etc. I just wanted to add that. Kandra talked about being equipped and trained. And we also talked about Sharon said something we might have forgotten, but she said something clearly about how Rikers was opened and being punitive and being an arm of slavery. And we know at a time such as this in a pandemic that we really want to look at the way that we're treating both Black and brown people and all people at this time. And if we could just do something different and just work at something different, I'm sure that we too will be more successful in our communities and as we come together as New York City. With that being said, April said, can you elaborate on Brooklyn Atlantic Avenue location and your desired plans for it? I can elaborate. I'd love for it to be high-rise apartments for us, affordable, meaning that really affordable. But anyway, I'm going to allow any one of our panelists. We know that the Brooklyn House, we call it the Brooklyn House, is located on Atlantic Avenue. I'm not sure. Can one of our panelists answer?
I want to take that on, and then in my response, I'll sprinkle some comments that I also directly to some of the other questions that I think have in queue that may inform those questions. You know, and I think I want folks to really walk away with this understanding as somebody who did 13 straight years in prison across 9 different prisons, right? But also touched every single jail in New York City except Queens. That's the only facility in New York City that I have not been into, including different facilities in Rikers Island. Of course, I'm not a woman, so that, you know, I wouldn't go to Rosie's, but I really want to rely on this experience for this and not the fact that I visited prisons across the country, et cetera, right? And that is that if you gave me a choice, right, to decide whether I had to live in a messed up place or a better place, I'm always going to pick the better place. And if I have to be there, I'm always going to choose the space that is least harmful to me, right? And that may include, you know, something that folks may not understand, like some very simple, like, you know, like grass and access to trees, et cetera, you know, or it may include something different, but it does impact folks different. And what I want to say is that, you know, we already think of folks who are inside of these spaces as not as our neighbors. And I use incarcerated neighbors as a really intentional term because it allows us to rethink exactly what should happen inside of these spaces, right? So when we think about what needs to happen there, what's missing from the existing one exactly, and more importantly, what it is that people need, because we can all talk about what we want, but when you really ask those people there, what it is that they need, right? My last job, I worked at the Urban Justice Center where I interviewed 123 people who were all released, right, within the last 5 years, and found that people were being released from Rikers Island without medication, wrong medication, undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, addresses to buildings that didn't even exist. So I really want to I really want to emphasize that, because sometimes it gets mixed, it gets lost in a conversation about what does actual restorative justice, what does rehabilitation, what are the services that people need, right? And then the folks who are doing that work, whether legislative, running for office or whatever, right? About our thinking about how we get there, you know? And when I think about any place, right? Because there has to be a question about, there is a huge question about accountability. How do we hold folks accountable? The existing system compared to something completely different that allows us to reimagine, right? Allows us to reimagine exactly what can be done. And this is beyond just an architectural makeup. I think that's the easy part. We can all build a building. In fact, I wrote an op-ed in the Daily News not too long ago that I said if we just move correction officers from one space to another, we're just recreating Rikers, and I still stand by that. But the piece that I really want to emphasize here, right, is that the changes that can be made are beyond architecture and can actually respond to policy. How does that look on a micro level, right? There's people who are handcuffed right now during therapy to a wall, right, and later sit there for 5 hours, and then the psychologist comes in and says, "Are you okay?" If I wasn't, there is something wrong now. So I want to emphasize that wanting, right, a cleaner place access to all of the things that everybody on the call, does not mean that we're advocating for incarceration or they even want incarceration, right? What helped me in prison wasn't the fact that I was locked in a cell for 23 hours a day. It was college. It just so happened that I discovered college while incarcerated. And sometimes that really gets missed. And I'm sorry I'm getting passionate, but it's like, you know, so when we think about what should happen in these spaces, whatever folks need in order to make sure that they never find themselves in a place where we do them more harm than they would probably even do to themselves. And if you judge a fish by his ability to climb a tree, will fail every time. And that is exactly what's happening right now. Whether you run for office or just a person who just logged onto social media and said, let me check this out. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Well, can I add something to that? I think also too that we need to, when we come to these words that just don't work, and I think that Tracy Gardner said that, we use words like rehabilitation, all of these treatment, all of these things that don't work. Right? And it hasn't been working. People need healing, right? They don't need services. They need healing. We need reparation. We need those things. Those are the words that we really need to start putting out there, because the reality is that there's a population that is disenfranchised, that is being targeted, and this is a population that has been harmed from the beginning. right? And those are the conversations that we need to really start having, that real talk, right? That real talk, because this is all just another form of slavery when we talk about incarceration, right? So we need to talk about healing, and then to look at people and not think that they need healing. And you're right, Johnny, is, you know, you don't look at them as your neighbors. Well, then just look at them as people. Just as people who have been hurt, who have been harmed, who have been broken, who have been damaged, and that they need healing. And this is what we need to start really putting out there. You can't correct people, right? You could heal them. And that's what we need to start having these conversations from the courtroom, right? On down, right? From moment of someone doing committing some kind of offense or crime, right? Is looking at what is behind it, not just the action, but what is behind it. And this is what people need to just really start thinking about, that people operate from their trauma. All right, I'm done.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Johnny, for that response. Healing and looking at people as people, our neighbors. We talk a lot. So speaking of our neighbors, we talk a lot about increasing COVID rates in the city. However, I have not heard any concern about our neighbors who are behind bars. What are the powers that be doing to release our vulnerable neighbors while they await their resolution of their cases? Kandra?
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is a prime example of how the powers that be are not doing enough to release folks, right? Because of COVID, what has happened is all of us providers, anyone who's an activist, who's an advocate, who's trying to get on the island to get people off, we've been blocked out of the system. So there's no volunteers that are allowed to go on the island right now, or in any of the borough-based facilities, and really work with folks and try to get them into alternative programming. The courts have been pretty much closed, and advocates and court advocates who run alternative to incarceration and alternative to detention programs across this city have been, you know, kind of forced out of the courts. And you can see that of why we were able to get that number down to 3,800 immediately, right? And how it's continued to grow. And now it's back up to about 4,800. And when you're seeing, as Darren had put up that chart earlier, right, there's 202 people that are still incarcerated on technical parole violations, which are literally non-criminal charges. They're not crimes. It is a violation, like Johnny had said earlier, around missing curfew or failing a drug test for marijuana, right? So even as a city, you know, us trying to push what also has happened as activists are coming together collectively, and we're working with the defender organizations and the legal aid organizations and trying to advocate for people to be released who are still on the inside. Now we're being told, after a few months of being able to do that, by the Department of Corrections and the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, so both at the city and state level, that we're not allowed to make requests for folks to be getting released anymore, that it has to come through either the Department of Corrections or like a judge or someone like that. So, you know, right now the judicial system can play a huge role in helping us get more folks released, and getting more, you know, court advocates in front of folks into these ATI and ATD programs. You know, releasing people who are there for the technical parole violations. If we could pass less is more, that's, you know, other 700 possible folks that we could get released. So it's just, if you look at it, the powers that be are not actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. And every step we take forward, they keep pushing us backwards as collective activists, right? And I think they're seeing that collectively we're strong together, that we can work with all the other organizations and really say, hey, here's a list of 500 people that need to be released right now. And I think that from them seeing that, I think that's where we're now getting the pushback, where they're saying, no, only DOC and DOCCS can say who they want to get released and who not. So this is a huge push. All of us need to be calling every single council member, the mayor, every single person who is working as an elected official to demand that our folks are being released right now. This is a pandemic, and you're like 10 times more likely to get, and I want to say 7 times more likely to die from COVID while you're inside. So there's really no excuse to it. The charges have not changed as they were before. It's the processes that they've been stopping from us to be able to get folks out through all of our networks that has been solved.
I'll add to that. In the meantime, folks are being held generally in confinement, and what that means and what we've seen in New York City, New York State, and literally across the country, is that we've seen a huge increase in the use of solitary confinement as a containment strategy for COVID-19, right? And that should bother you. And when you look at incarceration, it almost makes sense in the sense that it's so rooted in incarceration that our response to even public health issues is more incarceration within incarceration. So I really want to emphasize that we responded with harm to a public health response, and then eliminated the voices of the communities in that entire process and getting folks home. So yeah, thanks for sharing that, Kandra. It really triggered that thought.
And thanks for that question, Ronald. We appreciate it. Ms. Hampton has also asked us a question. What states provide good models for best practices of decarceration, alternative to incarceration, and or integration programs? Off the top of my head, I can definitely say Utah. Do know the name of the program. I'll let you know. Utah, Maine, and I think that Canada does a great job as well in some parts of Canada. But yes, if you have an opportunity to really look up some of the model programs across the United States, but I'm going to let our panelists talk about some that they may have experiences with.
Yeah, in my experience as working with a number of states, I haven't seen one state that gets it all right. I have seen states where pieces of that puzzle look better, than in other places, where progress is being made some ways very significant, other ways not as fast. Speaking on conditions, I'll say that Colorado is one of the states in the country that actually doesn't hold people in solitary confinement. We've seen advances across 14 other states where different populations have been excluded from being placed there, even released directly from solitary into society. In New Jersey, I would say that very recently they passed a bill there allowing time credits in the event of a national emergency like COVID. So right now, many people are sitting inside of a cell, et cetera, because of these policy restrictions. And, when a national emergency like COVID happens, like a pandemic, or I'll rely on my own incarceration, Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, right? Many of these correctional departments are tied up by legislative inaction. And we've seen that now. So New Jersey was actually, New Jersey very recently passed a time credit bill that allowed about over 3,000 people released from New Jersey. And it also changed the legislative landscape that in the event that the next time a national emergency is declared, these time cuts automatically, kick in. I'll say about, well, those two states really stick out for me right now as far as decarceration. And I'll say that it doesn't have to take a national pandemic to move legislators in action. So for those of you who are running into office, we understand that you can do what we ask you to do when you really want to do it, and we've seen this through COVID. And unfortunately, a national pandemic had to, a world pandemic had to bring us to a place where folks are decarcerating at a higher rate. Unfortunately, in other states, we haven't seen any decarceration, specifically, Indiana, hasn't seen any decarceration there, despite the fact that, their COVID rates are increasing higher than the national average. So those are my feedback as far as some states that really stick out for me.
And can I just add to that too? I just want to add really quick, even in New York City and New York State, alternative to incarceration programs have been proven to have recidivism rates 20% and lower, right? And we know that as a national or as a state average, the recidivism rate is still up to close to 70%. So we have the solutions, they're just not being funded to scale. This year's a prime example. Every single ATI program in New York City, their budget was cut in half. Now, if we as a society know that we can create a greater impact, we can, invest in folks and create that healing that Sharon was talking about, but we still choose to not cut DOC's budget, right? But all the ATI programs budgets got cut. So I'm just, if you look at it from a different perspective, like the money's there. It's just reallocating the funding and actually funding solutions to scale. When we know that things work, don't give us pennies to have them work. Actually invest in them, and we could actually have a greater impact in alternatives to incarceration and detention. So I just wanted to add that.
Right, and
Thank
so
you.
we know that there are a lot of ATIs, and actually I helped develop one under Housing Plus Solutions, which was very successful. And so there isn't enough investment in alternatives to incarceration. But when people want to talk about public safety, right, then we need to invest in the people, right, and get them healed and have them address the traumas. We have, as a society, have a way of always treating the problem, the symptoms, and not the root cause, right? Which is why we continuously find ourselves stuck in the same vicious cycle.
Thank you so much. So a few key takeaways. One of the things that I wanted our panelists to say, our time is up because it is my time to move it on over. But one of the things that people didn't say, and I'm going to make sure that I say loud and clear, that formerly incarcerated people can vote. So those of you who are on the line that want us to be able to support you as well in your journey of making our communities heal. Let me see what I got wrote down. Heal, human, equipped, invest, trauma trained. And I love what Johnny said, a new era of progressive leaders. That's what you see on this line on this evening. That's what's on this panel tonight. A new era of progressive leaders, and we want to side with you. We want to work with you so that we can change our communities to be something different. So just remember, formerly incarcerated people and people on Rikers Island can vote. So we know that that's why you're here tonight, making sure that you know what these constituents want for the place that they're calling Rikers Island. And we know what is going to happen. We are pushing for it sooner, but we also know now that you're well educated on some of the views of other voters. Yes. Yeah. With that, I'd just like to thank my panelists. Darren, do you have something to say? $5 and I'll let you say it. Put it in the cash app.
All right, it's coming, it might come in the mail. But I just wanted to say one thing to interject, because it's probably like one of the most, repetitious question that people ask me, like, why is directly impacted people, formerly incarcerated people, pushing for a borough-based plan? And one, I would like to say that because we experience incarceration, we know, and as long as people are incarcerated and detained, conditions matter. Like if we look at it's rebellions happening right now all across the country that people don't know about, and it's because of conditions. From the Attica Rebellion, if you read those demands, like half it was about conditions. The 2018 National Prison Strike that incarcerated people organized. If you read the first prison strike demand, it was about conditions, and it stated that immediate improvements to the conditions of prisons and prison policies that recognize the humanity of imprisoned men and women. That was the first prison strike demand. So I was in Brooklyn, in Brooklyn House, and I understand why they shut it down and did renovations, and that didn't stay up to scale, and they had to shut it down again, and it's closed today. The cells there are so small that they don't meet state minimum standards. They don't have the programming space. They don't have the social service space. So to improve that, right now, the plan is to go from 14 jails across the city down to 4, and improve conditions in these facilities and in our communities. And we continue to fight. We continue to decarcerate. And I just wanted to add that.
And the women can be moved off right now. So let me just make that very clear for everyone that there is less than 200 women at the Rose M. Singer Center on Rikers Island right now, and they don't need to be there. They don't have to wait to 2027 to be brought off. They could be brought off right now. Right now, immediately.
Yes, thank you so much. Any last sentence for Johnny?
Yeah, no matter how good your reentry program is, people are not going to take it if they don't feel safe. You know, no matter, those folks, right? I'll tell you something. I had a person call in from solitary confinement. They've been in solitary confinement for 20 years, you know, and we asked them, what do you want right now? You know? And yes, the first answer was to not be here. So, you know, of course we should use the last measure, if at all. But then the second question he asked was like, I'm tired of being in the cell with 3 people. I'm tired of plugging my ears with tissue because I'm scared that the roaches are going in my ear at the end of the night. You know, and the reason that I work for the Campaign Against Torture is because I tell you, to be locked in a cell under those conditions, right? And folks on this panel know, but to be locked in, to be forced to live in conditions that we probably wouldn't even hold our animals in, and no shade to animal lovers, I'm an animal lover, right? It really is a complete failure on the moral fabric of our society, but also of us as individuals. I don't feel comfortable walking by harm when I see it. I don't mind my business, you know? And I hope that folks go into these spaces, run for your office, do what you need to do, because we need folks to, we need folks in these spaces, but we don't need you perpetuating the harm, right? We don't need you working against our interests. So skip the press conference if you're not going to say the same thing behind closed doors, you know? And honestly, and I mean this, like, this is our community, and we want to work with you. It's always peace before war, but I learned in prison, you also got to be ready to go to war. And that's my personal stuff, not representative, not even my role in my position, but just know that accountability, it's important, not only self, but also us as a community, if we are to move away from everything that got us up to this point. So with that, I'm so honored to share space with all of you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation, especially as we narrow down who are some of the leaders in the elected spaces are going to be.
Yes, thank you so much. Kandra, last sentence.
Just reiterating that this plan is to shrink the system from 17,500 beds down to 3,300 beds. It's to shrink it from 14 jails down to 4. I know those people continue to not understand those numbers. We are still getting questions about that. And so I just really want to reiterate, this is a 75% decarceration plan that then we can continue to keep moving forward so one day we can reach abolition. So, and it's going to take all of us to do this across every single system, judges, district attorneys, the city council, the mayor, every elected official is going to play a role in this. And so we all need to have this common vision moving forward together so we can actually get this done. And that's all I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You guys are phenomenal. Thank you so much for behind the scenes. I am going to shout her out, my girl Sarita. We appreciate all that you have done, the Freedom Agenda. And I'm going to turn this part over to Brandon because he is going to give us our closing remarks. But we thank you for being here. We thank you for caring about who we are and who our communities are. And please shout out to all of our sisters and folks that's on the line, Catherine and Donna. We appreciate you guys as well. But Brandon, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Yolanda, and appreciate all of your hard work in preparing for this and moderating for everyone this evening. On the commitments that the city has currently made, we hope that everyone walks away from this knowing that we still have to hold them accountable and provide transparency to the public and folks who are not on the ground with us every day or who are not holding office on the ways that they can get involved. That includes closing all of the jails on Rikers Island and the existing borough facilities and the boat by 2027 at the latest, reducing the number of people in jails to less than 3,300 people in detention, reducing jail capacity by 75%, and ensuring improved conditions for anyone who is still detained. We also need to make investments in areas such as supportive housing, and that's permanent, affordable housing, not just transitional housing, mental health resources, and restorative justice or alternatives to incarceration programs. Where the city has not met existing demands, we have to continue to organize and win. We're still fighting to free more people and close Rikers faster. to pass the Renewable Rikers Act, to end solitary confinement in city jails and statewide in collaboration with the Halt Solitary campaign, and to divest from the Department of Correction, and to achieve reparative justice through deep investments in the most impacted communities, along the lines of what's outlined in our community reinvestment platform. We'll be following up by posting the video to this tonight so that everybody can save that, sharing a set of issue briefs that cover the info that each of the panelists touched on tonight. And we need 2021 candidates to be accountable to the survivors of Rikers Island and the communities that have made it possible to get a commitment to close Rikers by improving on the plans and making sure that we do not lose progress or halt progress in future administrations and future classes of council members. Thanks for taking the first step by joining us tonight. We will stay in touch with more opportunities to learn, engage, and have candidates forums. Thank you all.